Hello and welcome to the fifth episode of my Matura Perspectives. Today's webinar is about something that we're all familiar with, TED Talks, a rather unique feature of my perspectives, but also a highly efficient pedagogic tool that we could use to prepare the students for the exam, for Matura, but also that will enhance learners' competence. So we'll be looking at it from two perspectives. Perspective one is the Matura perspective, and perspective two is the overall language proficiency of the learners and how to develop it. So without further ado, let's move on to the agenda and the remaining parts of the webinar. Hope you'll enjoy it. So let me start by presenting the agenda for the webinar, and I will start off by some initial thoughts on motivation. I do believe that TED Talks and motivation go quite nicely hand in hand together. So talking about TED Talks basically means talking about motivation, how to motivate the learners and how to arouse their interest. Then I will very briefly talk about TED Talks themselves, very briefly because I don't think there's any need to talk about them in more detail because we all know what they are. Then the most important part of the webinar is talking about TED Talks as a pedagogic tool, the one that enhances learners' competence and also the one that helps them in dealing with certain tasks which are found in the Matura exam. And finally, I will talk about TED Talks as a springboard for promoting creativity and critical thinking, because it's not just about Matura, it's not just about linguistic competence in general, but TED Talks are very, very nice examples of getting the students to think critically, and also to be creative in language use, to be creative in expressing their ideas, and some other things which I will talk about in the final part of this webinar. So starting off with motivation and interest, I would like to show you the quote from Douglas Brown in his book Principles of Language Learning and Teaching, where he said that motivation is probably the most frequently used catch-all term for explaining the success or failure of virtually any complex task. He also says that asks a question: what does it mean that someone is motivated? How to create, foster and maintain motivation. And I realized that there have been lots and lots of books and publications about motivation, ranging from Zoltan Dornay to one of my favorite psychologists, Csikszentmihalyi, but we're not going to be that detailed. We're just going to look at motivation from the perspective of TED Talks and try to see how they can possibly keep the learners motivated and how they can arouse interest in them. So our most important question for this webinar would be how to motivate the learners and how to maintain a high level of motivation for as long as we possibly can. And we're going to look at motivation from two different angles. And the first angle is the content. So I believe that we have to keep it personal, or at least keep it personalized, because we know that the most interesting topic to discuss with other people is always me. And the students think the same. So if we are able to make things personal, to keep the topic personal, or at least personalized, then the students will be able to share their own knowledge, to share their own experiences with others, and as a result, the level of motivation and the level of interest in the activity should be high. Then the second important aspect is to make it unique. And TED Talks are unique. They are different from all those more typical and more predictable activities found in course books, like listening, like reading, like use of English, like vocabulary, picture descriptions and what have you. And every now and then it's a good idea to use something which is unique, because just by being unique it's interesting. Obviously we have to do it every now and then, because if we do it too often then it's no longer unique, and if it's no longer unique then the interest may flag and the motivation may go down. The third important aspect is to make it real or to make it realistic. And that means using authentic materials, that means using or resorting to authenticity and resorting to naturalness as pedagogic tools. And again, looking at TED Talks, they are highly authentic, they are highly natural because they have not been designed as ELT materials. They've been used as ELT materials, but their primary design was different. And then, apart from content, the second aspect of motivation and interest I would like to talk about is the form. The first important thing is to focus on learners' language needs. So look at problem areas that they have and trying to somehow go about them. And obviously, focusing on Matura is important, if not crucial, because we know and they know that they have to do it, and they have to do it well. So focusing on that is central. So we'll try to see how we could possibly use TED Talks as activities or as tasks that promote the development of Matura awareness and that give the students practice in doing Matura-oriented tasks. Then again, we've got focus on naturalness, but this time it's language naturalness and not content naturalness. So we will resort to something which I call the beyond the classroom approach, in which we'll be looking at the language that does not have to be used here and now, but which will be used in some real, genuine communicative encounters, but also something that might prove helpful in Matura tasks, for example, in speaking. And lastly, focusing on language development or giving the students a feel that they are learning something, giving the students a feel that they are learning something new, and as a result, that they are building up their language proficiency, that they are building up their repertoire of vocabulary and that of grammatical structures, but more vocabulary than grammar. Also, I'll try to talk about how TED Talks arouse, or at least may arouse, interest in the learners, whether they do at all. I do believe that they do, but that's going to be something I'll be talking about. How they are, or how they constitute a unique pedagogic tool, how they allow for personal or personalized expression, how they can be used as a platform for enriching one's lexical repertoire. So being natural, being authentic, they should be full of authentic language, especially lexical structures or vocabulary, generally speaking, that the students could learn and then use or reuse. And if we look at TED Talks, just a few lines really about TED Talks. When I opened the TED website, that's the first thing that I saw. TED ideas worth spreading, and you could see that TED believes that Black Lives Matter and that each of us has a role to play in opposing racism, injustice and oppression. We invite you to use our archive of powerful ideas from experts and thought leaders as a starting point to understand the roots of racism, its painful consequences, and how we can combat it together. So, you just open it, you look at it, and you see a potential lesson, a lesson that touches upon some current issues. So, you've got a lesson at a click of the mouse, really. Just a sketch, not really a proper lesson plan, but just a sketch of what can be done with the topic Black Lives Matter, a very, very current, very, very up-to-date topic. We know what's happening in the States at the moment, where the students are provided with a background by watching certain TED Talks. They are also provided with the views from the speakers, from those experts and thought leaders mentioned in the blurb, and they can obviously oppose those or juxtapose those with their own views. So that just shows you that this lesson, or I mean this talk, or a series of talks, or every TED talk actually has a lot of potential to be used as a pedagogic tool. But I'm going to be talking about in a moment, really, with more carefully sketched activities and tasks for you and for your learners. But that was just to show you that there's a potential in them, quite a big one. So we know that TED Talks are shortish, that they're up to 18 minutes of what they describe as powerful talks, and that the topics really vary from talk to talk. And if you look at what's trending now, the first one that pops up is this. What will a future without secrets look like? Amusing and interesting, or potentially interesting for your learners at least. How to separate facts and fiction online, something useful for the learners, even from the perspective of Matura, think reading, for example. What a world without prisons could look like, a potential candidate for a fruitful debate amongst your learners. Texting is killing language, JK, which I believe stands for joke. Again, a highly amusing but also informative talk that your students might find interesting, because we all know how teenagers are texting, and that the language they are using while texting is sometimes quite difficult to understand for other human beings. So what could be illuminating, what could be interesting for them, is to see how actually texting is done in English, and whether it's as difficult to understand as it is when they are texting in Polish for adults. Or the world's largest family reunion, we're all invited. That's more humanistic, more serious, but slightly frivolous at times. Just, giving you a flavour of the range or variety of topics that you could resort to while using TED Talks with your learners. If you go to the About section, there's the one called Debunking TED Myths. Is TED elitist? Is TED biased? Is TED full of pseudoscience? There's more, they just wouldn't fit on the slide. But again, I read through them and I thought, a potential lesson probably, where you could ask your students to read about TED myths before you do any watching or any listening with them. And then anytime you do a TED-based lesson, or anytime you do a TED Talk lesson with them, you ask them to answer the myth questions and justify their answers while referring to the TED Talk that they watched or that they listened to. So treating the Debunking TED Myths reading, Debunking TED Myths text as a checklist that could be used with any TED Talk that the students are confronted with and that the students do in the classroom or outside of the classroom. You know that My Perspectives is full of TED Talks, and I've chosen just some examples of the titles for you, just to give you a flavour of what's in My Perspectives. These come from different levels, ranging from 1 to 5. So we've got the mysterious workings of the adolescent brain, something interesting for teenagers, but probably more relevant for adults. So we learn more about why adolescents or teenagers behave the way they do, and what's behind it. Teach girls bravery, not perfection. Something, again, pretty much up to date, pretty much relevant, probably even more relevant for boys than girls, because it's all about perception. Our campaign to ban plastic bags in Bali, one of my favourite ones about environmental issues, as you can imagine. Why I'm a weekday vegetarian. This is kind of interesting with a rather funny thesis that says that if each of us ate half the meat that we typically eat, that might mean that 50% of the world population would turn vegetarian. Then you've got deep sea diving in a wheelchair. which I believe is self-explanatory. We've got Don't Eat the Marshmallow, which is about delaying gratification, or how to control someone else's arm with your brain, so kind of scientific. Again, the talks vary, they're different, there's a lot to choose from, and in my perspectives you will have a TED Talk every 2 units. So every 2 units there will be a TED Talk based lesson with lots and lots of practice of skills, lots and lots of practice of language, which I'm going to show you in a moment, because what I've chosen for you is one of my favorite TED Talks in one of the My Perspectives books, one of the My Perspectives levels. It's called Inside the Mind of a Master Procrastinator, from Tim Urban, who claims that I think all of you are procrastinators, and I believe he's right. I've chosen this one because I'm a procrastinator myself, and I've really stopped fighting with it because there's no point. This is what the lesson looks like. You've got the lesson spread over 2 pages, and as you can see, it's called Authentic Listening Skills. So the main focus here is listening, not viewing, but you could also use it as a viewing activity while playing the students the actual TED Talk as it was recorded. But the option of listening is also given just in case you would like to make it more kind of Matura orientated or more true to life in the classroom context. So let's briefly look at the methodology behind this lesson. Let's see what's in it, let's see what's in focus, let's see how the lesson starts, how it develops and how it ends, all based on the TED Talk about procrastination. So we start the lesson, actually every lesson that uses a TED Talk starts with a listening strategy training tip. In this case, it's about unknown words, difficult words, and what we've got there is something that we teachers are familiar with, that, you know, new words should not stop you, that they should not be the source of panic, that you should use different kind of strategies to somehow go about them. We've got words like major, papers, and spread out here, used as examples, and the funny thing about those strategy training tips is that they'll be put into practice later in subsequent activities. Then we've got the before you listen section with words like workflow, starts off light, bump it up, kick it up into high gear, revised all-nighter, procrastination, guardian angel, dormant, mayhem, entrepreneurial and sneaky. And the students are supposed to work together to figure out the meaning of these words and phrases, or use a dictionary if necessary. And obviously that could be a 2-step process, where in step 1 the teacher would encourage some sort of partial guessing. Partial is important as opposed to wild guessing. We want them to use at least their partial knowledge to make their guesses. And if that doesn't work, in pairs or in small groups, they could use the mobiles, because they don't use dictionaries anymore these days, so they could use the mobiles to find out what these words and phrases mean. But I would suggest doing that as a second stage of the activity, where at the first stage you would just get the students to guess or to kind of figure out what these words and expressions could mean. Then we move on to the while you listen part, where the students have to listen to the extract from the TED Talk about the speaker. So it's not really the TED Talk proper yet, but it's the information about who the speaker is. And again, we've got some sort of lexical focus here with words like self-starter, thesis, deadline, rational and instant gratification. And here we've got the context that comes into play that helps, or is meant to help, the learners to figure out the meaning of these words and expressions. Also, they could use some similarities with the first language, and perhaps some other skills. Perhaps the skills or strategies which were listed in this strategy, or presented in this strategy box at the very beginning of the lesson. So we've got the box, and then we've got the activity that puts the information from the box into practical use. Then you've got a little bit of personal touch. So we've got some statements, and the students have to decide which is true, or which is most true for them. So we've got things like, I often end up doing things days after I meant to do them, and it's like me, sometimes like me, and not like me. So something like scale, something that could be later used to compare the attitudes to doing the tasks on time, and basically for a discussion. Then we've got listening to part one. So the talk is actually chopped to make it more manageable as a listening activity for the learners. Here we've got a gap fill activity for them. Then we've got the second part. Again, something exam orientated. So we've got specific information which is taken out from the listening passage. Then we've got again something which is exam orientated, something which is a typical, or looks like a typical listening task. They have to listen to part 3 of the talk and match the events with periods of time. Then we've got part 4 of the talk. The talk is chopped, as I was saying, and then the students, we try to get the students to get more and more deeply into the text, which statement is not true according to Tim. So not just you have to listen to what he was saying, you have to listen to his claims and his views, but also you've got to try to figure out what he was not saying in his talk. So that's getting more and more deeply into it from the perspective, or from the point of view of meaning. Then we've got even more vocabulary. So we've got the sentences provided, the sentences taken from the TED Talk, and the students have to check if they know the meaning of the words, like big deal, on one's mind, stare, lose one's mind, long term, and aware. And obviously the question is if they can use those words and expressions in the context that differs from the one used in the TED Talk. Can they use that in speaking? Obviously the answer is yes. You can use it in a different context, you can use it in speaking, but probably just one encounter with a word or with an expression is not enough. So what we're trying to do in the next activity is to personalize the vocabulary. So we've got some examples of things, and the students have to compare their examples. So things that people make a big deal about, but which aren't that important in your opinion. And then you have to think about things that illustrate those things that people make a big deal about, but which aren't that important, or things you've had on your mind recently, or reasons why people sometimes stare, or any long-term plans or goals you have. So it's using the words, trying to make sure that the words get more personal, that you actually try to think of a story or try to think of an example that illustrates them in order for the words to sink in and to be remembered better, and subsequently to be used in those other contexts, like for example speaking. Imagine what happens if a student or a candidate during the speaking part uses any of those words. Lots and lots of points extra for them. And then at the end we've got the after you listen activity, where it's not just the vocabulary that is personalized, but the task gets personalized itself. So the students have to work in groups, look at different things that people do to stop procrastinating and getting distracted, and then they have to decide which of those tips would be helpful for them personally. So break jobs into small steps, for example, or download an app on your computer that stops you visiting your favorite websites, or plan your next week by writing a list of things to do each day. Yes, no, yes, to a certain extent, blah, blah, blah. They have to talk about them, they have to express their opinions. They'll have the ideas ready because they've listened to 4 parts of their presentation, 4 parts of the TED Talk. They've got the language ready because we've given them lots and lots of vocabulary beforehand, and what they have to do is to put their own ideas into their own words, using the ideas given and using the language given. And then we've got the challenge, which is some sort of extra speaking activity where they have to work in pairs. Here Tim believes that everyone is procrastinating on something in life. Tell your partner what you are procrastinating about and why. So again, things getting even more personal based on what the students were listening to, based on the language work that they did, based on the task. So the methodology, in my perspectives, for TED Talks is as follows. We start with some strategy training tips for listening. We try to make listening easier for them and make sure that the students panic less while attending to listening tasks in general. I said to you at the beginning that there is a TED Talk every 2 units, which means that every 2 units there will be a different strategy, both presented and practiced with the students. Then there's solid preparation work, both as channeling, so preparing them for the content, and from the perspective of language, and that's mostly vocabulary, complex and nice. Complex and nice, which may have its benefits when the students are doing those production-orientated tasks at the exam, at Matura, for example. If your vocabulary range is big, if your vocabulary is complex and nice, then obviously you score points. Then we've got solid language work, not just preparation work, but the work which is based on what the students have heard, what they've listened to. So we focus on vocabulary and the vocabulary from the listening passage. Then we've got some exam training. So we've got the tasks which resemble or are like Matura listening tasks. Usually the talk itself is broken into smaller bits to make it manageable for the learners. Then we've got some extended vocabulary practice, which I call the across skills lexical transfer, because firstly, the vocabulary gets personalized, not the task, but the vocabulary gets personalized, and it gets personalized because we want the students to be able to use or to transfer those lexical items across different skills, usually productive skills. And finally, we've got a discussion which is based on what the students were listening to, but also it's based on their experience and it involves critical thinking. So as you could see, the methodology is not that complex as a methodology, but it's complex in that it gives students lots of practice from different angles, from the perspective of cognition, from the perspective of language, and also they learn something about the world around them. We could obviously go further, and we could go beyond what's presented in my perspectives, what is actually presented in TED Talk lessons, and use something which is called the flipped classroom perspective or the flipped classroom approach, where we could further channel the learners. For example, ask them to Google Tim Urban, the author of our Procrastination TED Talk, and be ready to talk or to tell the class about him. And that's something I call a research-based preparation task for the TED Talk, for the listening activity. Research-based because the students have to do their own research before the lesson starts, so they come channeled, sort of, to a lesson. And if you Google Tim Urban, I did, that's what you get. You've got some information about him, but the first hit is called Wait, But Why? And that's his website, the website he runs with his friend. And in this website you will see lots of nice drawings by Tim, and they are all about the current social and political situation in the world and in the USA. You could see he's got a Twitter account as well, so there will be some information for the learners before you get them to watch, before you get them to listen to the talk. As you can see at the bottom of the page, it says Filme. There are actually there's one film which is a TED Talk that he did, which I really recommend. that you watch or that your students watch if you happen to use my perspectives. So the next idea would be to actually watch the full talk on procrastination, and you could do it using two different media. You could watch it on the actual TED website. So you just type in Tim Urban, and that's the first hit you get. As you can see below the film, you've got some details about the talk, so some kind of introductory basic information, but also you've got transcript in 43 different languages, including Polish, and also obviously including English. There's some reading list with further reading, which I'm not sure your students will be too happy to go through, but also we've got some footnotes with some references which might be helpful to understand the talk more deeply, if the talk needs to be understood more deeply, and some comments that your students can make if they feel like it. So that's one of the possibilities of watching it. The other possibility, or the other channel to watch this TED Talk or any other TED Talk which is used in my perspectives, would be to use the actual DVD that goes together with my perspectives, and this version, I mean the TED Talk version from the TED website, you could watch. You could get the students to watch at home. The DVD version can be watched in class if you have the equipment to do so. Then another possible activity, or another possible way of using the flipped classroom approach, would be to Google famous procrastinators and asking the students to choose one of them and tell the class about him or about her, or the group if you want your students to work in groups. And again, I googled that, and as you could see, the first one is Bill Clinton. I've chosen top 10 most famous procrastinators in the world. There's Dalai Lama there, there's Margaret Atwood there, there's some William Coleridge there, so there's quite a few famous names. Obviously my choice was Bill Clinton, and if I was a student, if that was my homework, I would tell the group about how Bill Clinton was a procrastinator as the US president. We can go even more beyond, if I can say that, and we could ask the learners to watch a TED Talk of their choice. So you could just tell them, okay, watch any TED Talk really. Choose whatever you want to choose. You could help them a little bit when it comes to choosing the right talk. You could tell them that they could narrow down the search to a particular theme, like if they want to watch something about technology, they can just click technology. If they want to watch something about food or science or whatever, they'll click the right button in the search engine, or they can just type in any keyword that they think will be relevant and appropriate. It doesn't really matter. Then after they've done it in class, they come to class and they work together in groups, and they tell each other what TED Talk they have chosen, why, what was it about, was it funny, was it witty, was it educational, was it mind-blowing, was it perhaps boring. They'll just tell each other what it was about, in simple words, really. Nothing serious, nothing big, just 2-3 sentences, and that does the job, just to transfer the viewing experience to the classroom experience, where the channel changes from watching or viewing to speaking. They could choose something like that, for example, which is, surprisingly or not, in the top 25 list, 10 things you didn't know about orgasm. But if they choose it, they choose it. It's completely up to them. I don't think we should interfere. It's in top 25, but it's not the most popular one, because the most popular one is apparently the one that you could see here is number 1. Do schools kill creativity? From Serkin Robinson, one of my favorite TED Talks. Then we could also ask them to prepare a TED Talk in pairs or in small groups, to record it actually. Tell them to choose the topic they want, tell them that it should be funny, but it also should be supported with some evidence, because we don't want any pseudoscience with TED Talks. They could record it and send it to you, or they could just put it on YouTube, but not to the open channel. Tell them not to put it on the open channel, but on the restricted channel, so not everybody can watch it, but just the teacher who will get the link from them. And you could treat it as a project that they'll be supposed to do in a semester. You could ask them to choose a short TED Talk. TED Talks are maximum 18 minutes, but the shortest are from 5 to 6 minutes. And then to use the transcript feature I was telling you about, obviously the English version, to present 6 interesting expressions to the class. And that could be our zadanie na szóstkę for the learners. And that could show you how students perceive vocabulary, what they perceive to be important, what they perceive to be relevant, or what they perceive to be useful. So, long story short, some final remarks. Every TED Talk tells a story, which means that every TED Talk has a lot of potential to be used as a pedagogic tool. I think there are no exceptions to it. I mean, whatever you take, it really lends itself to a nice classroom experience, to a nice classroom practice-based task, even the one about orgasm. And as such is a perfect basis for a skills and vocabulary lesson. So you practice listening, you practice viewing. If you're not really concerned with Matura, it could be viewing. And you focus on a lot of vocabulary that you can extract from the transcript, or you could just use the one or the ones from my perspectives. TED Talks develop learners as humans and citizens, not just as language users. And I think that's really very important, especially in the 21st century, that we try to teach them English, but we also try to show them what's right and what's wrong, and how to behave and how not to behave, and what becomes and what doesn't become. So they develop learners as humans and citizens. I think that's a very, very important feature. They're great for enriching vocabulary stock, complex vocabulary, rich vocabulary, but also natural vocabulary that is used or heard in everyday conversations. And as they are deeply emotional, they will be remembered, and hopefully so will be the language used in them. And they develop critical thinking and broaden learners' horizons. So thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much for joining the webinar, the whole series of webinars. And I hope you found it useful and beneficial, and that you will start using some of the ideas next year when the online learning is hopefully over, and that we'll be able to talk to our students face to face and not really with the aid of the computer and technology. Before I go, as always, I'd like to show you the contact slide to Nova Era, and for now, that's all from me. Bye.